For more, I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Rochelle Ferguson-Bouyahi. Hello to you, Rochelle.
Good morning.
When you look at this letter, tell us a little bit more about what Zelensky is actually proposing.
Well, let's start off by saying just how rare a direct address to Vladimir Putin is from Volodymyr Zelensky. That, of course, suggesting perhaps a shift in tactic by Zelensky there. This 1,800-word letter then proposing that both leaders meet, that they agree on a strategy to get them out of this 4-year war. A caveat then from Kyiv, because they say if this isn't done, we stand ready to fight, ready to continue fighting for our existence. The message from Zelensky in that letter is clear then. It says, don't be afraid to take the path out of war. Don't be afraid to start diplomacy in earnest. Now, one thing that Volodymyr Zelensky does in that letter is stresses that the United States is otherwise occupied. They've got their eyes firmly fixed on Iran and coming to a kind of ceasefire deal with Iran. He said it would be simply wrong to wait until the war in Europe becomes once again on the agenda, because it's clearly not as far as Zelensky is concerned at the moment. There's this appeal as well, which is interesting, Will, to Russia's Vladimir Putin, where he says the majority of Russians have grown tired. They're exhausted with Ukrainian drones and missiles, which are more and more frequent on Ukrainian soil. He says they're also exhausted by the inflation, by the fact that there are fuel shortages. They are ready for peace. Listen to Russians. Zelensky claims, he gives a figure there. He says that in the month of May, according to his intelligence, 30,000 Russian soldiers either died or were injured on the front line. And he says in the 21st century, that kind of ratio is not one that you can keep up. The negotiations need to take place around the table. You spoke about tone there. There is a defiant tone from Zelensky in this. There's also a kind of mocking tone, again, with this frequency of drones and missiles. And this, reference to, he says, 26 years ago when you came to power, Putin, people were happy about it. That's no longer the case. You're out of touch. And then, he finishes up that letter by saying there are several countries who could mediate these talks. Let's think Switzerland, let's think Turkey, and also Arab nations who are increasingly at the forefront of international diplomacy.
Yeah, the timing's interesting because this letter comes as Putin's addressing his annual economic conference in St. Petersburg, all as the wartime economy has been stagnating.
Well, absolutely. This is the 5th wartime economic conference in St. Petersburg, known as the Russian Davos. This year, though, it has to be said, it takes place when Russia's economy is stagnating. The Russian government is looking for ways to diversify, for ways to resume growth, which is taking a hit. It's worth saying that just before this summit, which began on Wednesday, there were Ukrainian drones that hit an oil refinery just on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. Analysts then will saying that this is really quite an embarrassment for Vladimir Putin, and an embarrassment for the fact that Russian air defences weren't able to stop this. So you had these dignitaries arriving from around the world to the backdrop of black smoke because, Ukrainian missiles had just hit the outskirts of St. Petersburg. Not the image that Russia wants to be giving on, the time of a big conference like this. Just in terms of, let me give you some figures. Russia's 3 trillion economy, then I can bring up those figures there for you, hopefully. It's slowed down to 1% growth. That's back from 4.9% in 2024. It shrank at the beginning of this year by 0.3%. So that's the first quarter of the year. So that totals essentially an $80 billion budget deficit. The Kremlin blaming then high interest rates, a strong ruble, as well as Western sanctions. The fact that the matter is, this is really putting the Russian economy in the trickiest spot, we might say, since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
All right, Rochelle, thank you very much. Rochelle Ferguson-Bouyahi, our international affairs editor.